Okay, we're back with the next episode of All Things Facades podcast. And this episode is going to focus on passive house in commercial buildings. So here we have Ryan and Lewis from Handel Architects. And this group has really formed themselves to be the experts in the industry when it comes to passive house building applications in commercial construction, particularly in the Northeast. And the reason that I wanted to have the two of you on the podcast is because looking at your portfolio, there's just been such a diverse, wide range of facade types that you've been able to make implementable and work and achieve that passive house certification. So I'm going to give it off to you. But really, I want to start off by asking both of you, where did the interest come from? I know you guys are not new to the industry. So how did you both sort of find yourself as the passive house guys within Handel and in the industry? Ryan, I'll let you start.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian, for having us on. Passive house for us is interesting. We've always been interested in advancing high performance buildings, but passive house specifically came to us from a client. And so the house at Cornell Tech, that was a competition, an RFP, and Hudson, our developer partner on that, came with passive house to us. So we had heard about it beforehand, but we thought it was just single family homes and the like, and didn't realize the scale that that it could be done. And they say, hey, can we do this? And we investigate. We're like, yeah, we think we can. And so we put that into the RFP. Then Cornell Tech kind of saw that and was like, wow, that's a differentiator. We talked to them. We ended up winning the competition. And so for us at Handel Architects, this really came from our clients. So like they know that we can deliver high performance buildings, and that we're experts at I would say mixed use and complex programs and programs from the client, and integrating it into a cohesive building. And so adding the passive house component to it was the unique thing on Cornell Tech. And so we've been able to continually evolve since then, the passive house standard in our large buildings, multifamily buildings, from dormitories, student housing, affordable housing, as well as now with Winthrop Center in Boston, a large office building passive house as well. So I think our interest is in more just in terms of sustainability and trying to heal the planet and mitigate climate change. High performance building as architects, like that's the method that we can do, and we think the passive house is one of the most important tools right now to helping us get there.
So Lewis, have the two of you worked together a lot within Handel, and how did the two of you sort of fall into that role on Cornell Tech? And then was it just the perfect marriage and you decided to run with the group?
Yeah, I think. Thanks for having us. And yeah, so Ryan and I have both been very active internally in the office in our sustainability group, which when we started at Handel, we both started around the same time, 12 years ago here. And when we started, the sustainability group was really a bottom up thing that was a collection of folks that were concerned about the trajectory of the planet and climate, and kicking around ideas as to how we could impact it. And it's really, it's evolved alongside our work and our portfolio and our individual careers. I mean, as Ryan noted, Cornell was really the first passive house job that came to us and really instigated this whole kind of conversation around passive house. And I think we really grabbed onto it because it felt very tangible, right? All these kind of issues that we were dealing with in the group, in these conversations around energy use, fossil fuel demand, this felt like a real science-based, logical way to apply a methodology to have an actual impact here. And so we really embraced that. Ryan and I worked together on Cornell. I was only partially involved in that project. Ryan was much more involved in that. And then our kind of collaboration really came to fruition on the next passive house project, which is Sendero Verde, a 100% affordable development in East Harlem that we're near completion on now. And in that timeline since we started the passive house projects, my role's transitioned from project architect to the director of sustainable design here at the office, and that's kind of signified in an elevation of sustainable design in the office from this kind of bottom up group to something that is we're really making an investment in. And we're trying to take what we're learning on all these projects and applying it not just to our passive house work, but to the other jobs as well. Because it is, what's great about passive house is that it's rooted in concepts, and those concepts can be applied universally. It's not a, hit this number, hit that number. It is about kind of holistic performance. And if you understand the concepts behind that, you can carry that through even in non-certified buildings.
So I think we need to take a step back and really dive into what does passive house mean, and especially because both of you have a sustainability background. If you think back to exactly what that time frame is, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, what were some of your misconceptions about passive house? And before that, were you working on a lot of LEED certified buildings? And what were some of the flaws in that way of thinking? And what is passive house designed to improve upon that methodology?
That's a big question, Adrian. So
well, let's see what you got.
let me maybe I'll just let me do a quick kind of passive house 101 here, just kind of like I think a lot of people are aware of it, but it is helpful to sometimes just kind of remind people what it is, what exactly is passive house. At Handel Architects, we like passive house because it's focused on energy use. It's not a checklist, it's more holistic, which is a direct comparison to LEED, although they have been changing their system lately. And passive house results in a well-constructed and a quality building and a healthy interior environment for the occupants. It's a certification program that is trying to reduce energy use and increase user comfort. And its focus is primarily on two things: the building enclosure and the mechanical systems. From an architectural point of view, it requires careful detailing during design. And then when it comes to construction, it requires a quality control program and a buy-in from the CM, from the subs, in order to make sure that well-detailed design drawings results in extremely well-built building as well. And we like passive house kind of from two big point of views. I already mentioned it earlier. Just one is about combating climate change. A passive house can reduce the energy needed to operate a building by 60 to 80% compared to code, which then eliminates our dependence on fossil fuels, reducing our carbon emissions, lowering our greenhouse gas impact. We think that passive house is allowing us to start to bridge the gap to net zero ready and net zero carbon buildings. And codes are becoming more strict, and they're actually starting to get closer and closer to the passive house standard. And so we think passive house can start to ease compliance with these government mandates, and the step is becoming less and less. So it's an easier ask for our clients and for architects to achieve. In addition to combating climate change, we like passive house because of the health and wellness benefits. And I will say, when we approached Cornell Tech, it was mostly about energy use. But then we saw the results of that building, and that's when the health and wellness really struck home for me. A passive house actually offers a healthier interior environment. It's a superior indoor air quality because we're providing fresh, filtered ventilation to every room 24/7. It's actually a quieter interior environment, which for me, that means like passive house is ideal for like these kind of noisy urban environments. When you have a well-insulated and air-sealed wall, it's actually a quieter, acoustically quieter environment, which is good for mental health. And that air sealing increases the durability of the building materials in your building too, not just within the wall, but like some interior finishes, which increases longevity and reduces some maintenance. And with a focus on thermal comfort, you end up eliminating drafts and temperature differentials that people always complain about in buildings. And
so
how
do you let me,
yeah.
Because I think this is really interesting from the occupant comfort standpoint. I get it because I've lived it and experienced it, but I think it's really hard for somebody to grasp that without tangibly feeling it and seeing it and experiencing it. So right now I live in a pre-war building, and it's a brick cavity masonry facade that's probably not well insulated. It's windows that are probably 20 years old. And so in my living room in the winter, when I'm sitting close to the wall, it's uncomfortable. I need to blast the heat, and you can feel the vast difference between the center, the kitchen area versus closer to the wall. So until you really feel that and live that, how do you, I guess, communicate that value proposition to the end user? Have you brought people into the building and shown them the difference?
I mean, just taking people on visits into a passive house building, you notice a difference right away in terms of the acoustics, and on a really cold day, you definitely notice the temperature too. Like on Cornell Tech, we have a double glazed curtain wall at our ground floor, and you can walk right up to the glass. And we do have some perimeter conditioning there, but you feel comfortable in the space. And we all have the experience of being in these kind of glass lobbies in New York, where like you can't get too close to the glass. It's kind of it's uncomfortable, right? And Lewis, you and I were talking about this the other day in terms of multifamily versus office program. Maybe you want to talk about like temperature differences in there between the two programs as well.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think just step by one step there. I mean, Adrian, I think in terms of communicating the benefits, I think the story you just told is exactly what we also try to do. I mean, it's especially it's more challenging outside of New York in some ways, but in New York, a lot of people have the experience you just outlined, right? I mean, I live in an old brownstone building there, on the facade. If I'm sitting 6 feet from it, the side of my body facing the facade is much colder than the other side, and that sets up that discomfort. And I think people are familiar with that experience. The amount of dust that we see in our apartments, that is all, or not all, but largely infiltrated through your facade. I mean, your facade is a leaky sieve, and it's just pulling all sorts of stuff in, and that doesn't happen in a passive house building, because you are in that airtight facade. This goes back to that kind of foundational concepts approach there, and the idea that this is a holistic performance-based system. You, in order to achieve certification, you have to hit these performance targets, and that, I think, is a fundamental difference between like a LEED checklist and passive house. While you could achieve passive house levels with a LEED certification, approaching certain credits certain ways, you don't have to. You can get certified without dealing as aggressively with energy as you would with passive house. So you're kind of forced to think about all the ways that energy is used and distributed in your building, and how that impacts comfort and how that impacts energy performance. So to Ryan's point about the difference between commercial buildings and residential buildings, that's something that we got to kind of learn and experience in our work at with Winthrop Center in Boston, which was our first commercial passive house. There, thermal comfort at the windows wasn't as significant an issue as it was in a residential building, and that's largely because there's just such a different way that building is used. The use patterns, people are not there overnight when it's the coldest, and the amount of internal loads inside the space. You've got monitors and hundreds of people on any given floor, breathing and talking and moving, and that's just creating a tremendous amount of internal load that you don't have in a residential building. And the passive house model takes all that into account and considers that as it's setting parameters for what your what your facade performance needs to be. So that's slightly off topic from your question there, but
No, but I mean, where codes are going, I mean, I think they implemented a requirement for air tightness testing in Seattle now. So with that, now you have envelope backstops being implemented. At what point is sort of the evolution of the code and passive house certification going to become synergistic, and it's going to just be another checkbox for someone to say, okay, now we have a passive house certified building. Why not just move forward with it?
I think they're at what point, I'm not sure. Obviously, it's going to change at different places around the country, but that is the trajectory that we are on. Codes are getting closer and closer to passive house levels. We're seeing there's places in Europe that are already kind of adopting a passive house equivalent code. Massachusetts has recently updated their energy code, and it is, at least for multifamily residential buildings, very much in line with a passive house building. I believe there's air tightness testing being required there as well. I think that the interesting question for me as you look forward in that, with regards to passive house codes, is how does embodied carbon and material health start to tie into it, because as we've just in the 7-8 years that we've been really kind of digging our hands into the passive house world here, the conversation around embodied carbon has evolved a ton, and we're starting to see questions of triple glazing. Yes, you can hit that excellent U value, but are the operational benefits worth the embodied impacts? And then there's that you can expand that into the kind of social questions around the manufacturing of the glass. I mean, there's a lot of interesting discussion. So it'll be interesting to see how those things start to kind of collide and interact with each other as codes evolve over the next few cycles. But standing here today, knowing what we know, it seems like we are very much heading towards a passive house energy code baseline for at least major cities around the United States.
Before we dive into the different system types, I want to sort of dig into, because I want to uncover sort of your architectural brain and look at from a design standpoint, because I come from facade consulting background, and we were always taught focus on the performance, don't look at aesthetics. That's not our job. And so I want to talk about the aesthetic side and design side of it. Before you started down this path, and obviously you have 3 very unique different facade types implemented now at Passive House way.
We got more than that, Adrian. We got 4, maybe 5.
Maybe more coming that we don't know about. But Before you started down this path, did you see going down the passive house route as a hindrance to your design possibilities? How do you see it now? I mean, how is that expanding? Do you look at any building throughout New York City and say, if we detail that properly, that could be passive house? And have you come to the point where you see no limitation?
So like we mentioned before that passive house is performance based. So there's no style, there's no aesthetic standard that is dictated by a passive house design. So our house at Cornell Tech, that's a mega panel rain screen metal panel system. Our Sendero Verde project has a masonry cavity wall and EFIS facade. Winthrop Center in Boston is a triple glazed curtain wall facade, and our UTSC dormitory up in Toronto is a stick built rain screen metal panel. So like they all have very different aesthetics, and I would say all of those projects, the clients all had different programs and needs as well. And so like I felt like I feel like passive house really allows us as designers flexibility to create any option. It's just another set of criteria. It doesn't limit us in terms of creativity. And so I think that's important. We also tried to, Lewis was talking about LEED and carbon. Right now, carbon is not addressed in the passive house standard, but I know they're looking at it. But what we like to do is, like, when you're using a performance-based standard like passive house, we like to pair it up with a LEED, with an enterprise green community, something that is more prescriptive, because they kind of cover each other's blind spots in a certain way. And so in terms of material choices and so you're things that aren't addressed by the passive house standard, you're still thinking about them in a sustainable manner. And I think that's important. There's, in terms of aesthetic, like we're open for business. Like, you can do anything here. And yes, obviously there's different, you do triple glazed curtain wall for multifamily, you're going to have a different response than if it's for an office building. Like, there's different responses, but I don't think aesthetics really came into it, and that's actually something we share with our office. We're like, we're developing details for all kinds of different facade types that all are meeting passive house that we're then able to translate into our non-passive house projects. This kind of like rising tide lifts all boats type of scenario, where like a detail that we developed on a passive house, we found some details. I'm thinking specifically about like at our parapet conditions, where we use AAC blocks for the first to run so that we don't have to pull insulation up and around. It's actually more cost effective to do the passive house and more energy efficient detail than the business as usual case. So like that's being implemented across all of our projects, and that's great as well. But in
You don't
terms
have
of
to use
aesthetics,
any
it's open.
unlimited. You don't have to use any specific project examples, but have studies been done? Is there any data or metrics that can show going down this route and spending more upfront will yield lower operational expenses down the line, and here's your ROI, and making the case to an owner early on from that standpoint?
Yes.
Yes, there is. It's challenged by the reality of operating a building, right? There's a lot of large scale pass house buildings have come online in the last few years, and there is data out there on how those buildings are performing, modeled versus actual. Stephen Winter Associates has done a tremendous amount of research and done some great presentations on this at different conferences. But what's interesting is that you see a lot of variation, and that really comes down to two things. Understanding the model inputs and the operation of the building. Operation of the building is obvious. You need people who are operating these buildings, especially when we're talking, it's a little different with commercial buildings. A building like Winthrop, they're going to have an engineer on staff that is, knows how to operate complex systems, because that's what a Class A office commercial building of that size and scale in Boston would have, right? But when you look at multifamily buildings, especially affordable multifamily buildings, they're not used to having the level of complexity in the systems that we see. So while the facade is a simple piece that is easy to kind of incorporate, on the MEP side, there's some complexity, there's some commissioning, there's some ongoing operation that needs to be maintained, and that can be a challenge. And the other side of it is that this system, the passive house model, or the passive house energy model, is built on a European model, and in Germany, there's slightly different standards for comfort. There's slightly different standards for how much space a person occupies, how many showers a person takes a day, how long those showers are, how hot the temperature of those showers are. All these things are plugged into the model and as assumptions. And we are learning over the course of the last 6 or 7 years that some of those assumptions are off, and that is now needing to be kind of evolved and adjusted. That said, there's a clear benefit. There is a clear significant reduction in energy use that can be demonstrated, that is being demonstrated, and And that's what makes Passive House like a phenomenal system for a long-term owner. Someone that's going to have this building in their portfolio for decades. They're going to see the benefits of this upfront investment, and that comes on the side of utility costs. It also comes on the side if you're in a city like New York, when it comes to future penalties. We're all aware of Local Law 97. Or maybe we're not, but high level overview: buildings over a certain size are going to get charged a penalty for greenhouse gas emissions over a set threshold, and that penalty is going to increase, and that threshold is going to decrease over the course of the next 25 years. And buildings that are built to Passive House today, we've done some preliminary modeling. Buildings that are built to Passive House today, stay below those thresholds where penalties can accrue, well into like kind of late 2030. And there's a lot of variables in there, but we think would kind of carry you all the way through to even to 2050 without accruing penalties, if again, a certain assumptions and variables being made there. But we have done some preliminary modeling showing that.
So how do you,
Adrian, can I
Ryan.
jump in real quick on
Yeah.
ROI? So we tend to think of ROI as like how much is a system cost to implement, and how much energy does it save over a course of amount of time. That's like how we typically think about it. I've been speaking to some other folks in the industry and developers when they're looking at the health and wellness benefits, and this is something that's much more, I think, marketable to the layperson than energy savings. The health and wellness benefits of having 24/7 clean, fresh air and what that does to a person's health are exponentially higher than what the energy savings are compared to a code building. And so I'm interested in seeing studies specifically on Passive House. I've seen these studies on well buildings, and where they have been able to quantify the amount of health and wellness benefits that accrue to the residents, to the tenants of these buildings. And from that point of view, the ROI is like, it's mind-blowing. It's exponentially higher than just the cost of energy that you're saving.
Well, I actually didn't think about this until you just said that. During COVID, did you see a spark of interest in, people working from home and spending a lot of time at home? So all of a sudden during the day they were in an office building, now during the day they're at home. So developers being more cognizant over amenities, occupant comfort, occupant health, and just being
Yes.
able to advertise a building from that standpoint.
Yeah, and it coincides with what I was saying. When we started with Cornell Tech, our focus was also on energy reduction and emissions reductions. And then when we went into Sendero Verde, that process really started in 2017, so predates COVID, but that's when we started to become aware of the health and wellness benefits. I think when COVID happened, and the ability to have your ERVs on the roof, providing filtered fresh air, your air sealed, compartmentalized from all of the adjacent units, within the building as well. And that's like a LEED or enterprise green communities requirement. But like that's when I feel like the developers and our clients really started to see those benefits as marketable to the general population. And we now see there's in New York, there are many projects that are Passive House multifamily projects that are being marketed, not that they're saving energy, but that they're providing a healthier lifestyle. And that's where they're getting the most kind of percolation, I would say, in the bloodstream for the general population.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point is what is marketable. And when we're talking about ROI, as Ryan kind of mentions there, I think in this, this is speaking mostly to multifamily residential buildings, but when we're talking about Passive House, it tends to be that the thing that brings developers the most pause is not the upfront cost of doing the upgrades. It's the impact on marketing the units, right? If the kind of idea of luxury is more glass, floor to ceiling windows, then you're going to have a hard time, marketing a Passive House building. And if I can speak a little more about glass percentage here, I'm sure we'll get to that. But if you're as we start to see attitudes shift towards, because of COVID, or in part because of COVID and because of other, things that are kind of happening in society, as we see people's focus shift towards health and wellness, understanding a little bit more about the dangers that exist in interior environments, and that being more marketable to the general public, that I think is actually going to have a much greater impact, at least in the kind of market rate residential sector there, that'll have a great impact on kind of getting these upgrades implemented. As Ryan noted, a lot of the multifamily passive house buildings in New York that are in operation now, when you go to their websites, the thing that is front and center is the health benefits, not necessarily the energy benefits.
Well, all right. So I want to get to now how you made a curtain wall work, especially in a passive house application, and touch on window to wall ratio. One thing I kind of want to pick your brain on and hear your reaction is I think a lot of people think passive house and that you have to try to reinvent the wheel, especially today in our sort of modern, innovative industry. People are always trying to introduce new technology, different materials for the structure, for the fenestration. And you have these prime examples of commercial passive house building where you utilized aluminum punched windows. Schuco did Cornell Tech, and where Sodawall did the curtain wall up in Boston. And same type of hand laid brick cavity wall construction that you utilized in the past. So I want you guys to sort of eliminate that misnomer that we have to introduce things that have never been done before, and these are details that you've done on other buildings.
Yeah, I think that was so Cornell, our first passive house, it was a mega panel wall. It was, this big beautiful facade system. It was fantastic. But we really, belts and suspenders, went all out to make that thing perfect because it hadn't been done before, and we wanted to make sure that it was done correctly. So with our second passive house building, Sendero Verde, we it's a 100% affordable housing development, and there was a focus for us just internally for our own kind of understanding, and also of the developer from an affordability standpoint, to be able to deliver that level of performance with existing technologies. They wanted to be able to hand drawings to a mason, and the mason know exactly what they're looking at and be able to bid on it in a way that wasn't going to terrify them. And so we really focused, working with our pre-construction team at L&M Development and Jonathan Rose Companies, and then all of our consultants there, to assemble details that we thought could be easily constructed and made sense in terms of sequencing and with materials and approaches that were common practice today. And we were able to, to achieve that. We have, two of those three buildings are certified, and the third one will be certified here in June. And I think, since then we've been exploring, can we do this with other facade types? Curtain wall has been this kind of had this dream. Can we do a passive house curtain wall building? And we've done a few different studies on that, and a few different we did one very in-depth feasibility study on a multifamily residential building using curtain wall, and we actually came to the conclusion with that one that we couldn't do it. We couldn't make it work. And that was not necessarily driven by the absence of technology. It was driven by the market demand not really aligning with what you could achieve. The amount of clear fenestration that you would end up with, you had a lot of spandrel, right? And it just doesn't work out as well with what we were trying to do there. But at Winthrop, partially, which is a commercial office building, we were able to make a curtain wall work there. Partially because of the kind of differences in use types and internal loads that I mentioned earlier. How the building has a kind of source of heat inside it that doesn't exist in a residential building. But also really because of the site. Winthrop is a all glass curtain wall building. You look at that thing, you're like, wow, that is a glass curtain wall building. But it's only 40% glazing, which you'd be surprised to here, transparent glazing at least. There are spandrel areas, but it's an infill site, right? So you have two very tall buildings on either side of that building that made it such that you wouldn't have wanted to make it all glass anyway. We couldn't, even because of code, you needed a certain amount of opaque area. So what we were able to do there is kind of strategically deploy the opaque wall on those facades and really focus on having expansive glazing where it's visible, where people really want to see, where the views are great. And so it wasn't about making an all glass building. It was about making a glass building that had glass where you wanted it, where it made the most sense, where it was most marketable. And that, I think, is something that goes back to that kind of design and aesthetics question. I mean, that's where architecture happens, right? We're taking the conditions and we're trying to figure out how to make the most with them within this kind of performance standard that we set out for ourselves, or that the owner set out for us.
So what are some of the hidden or upfront costs required, other than getting a passive house consultant on board and having, a team like you or just people that have experience doing it? What are some things that a building owner has to think about in terms of if they want to go down this route, what upfront costs are required?
Let me jump on this one. I think that, from an architect's point of view, particularly with these complex, multi-program, multi-tenant, large buildings, we already have a really large consultant team. And so like you're going from a consultant team that maybe, 15 different companies working on something, adding a passive house consultant, adding a 16th consultant, like it wasn't a big ask, so from like kind of a planning and I think from an owner's point of view, also like obviously there's a cost associated with an additional consultant, but in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of de minimis when you compare it to the size of the project. And so in terms of, so that's one point. Then I would say that then the second point is like when you're planning, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, guys. You can cut this out, right?
Go interrupt, Lewis.
Keep it in. No. I think, so there's the soft costs, the passive consultant, and then on the
yeah, I mean, where I don't mean to interrupt, but maybe you can riff on this a little bit. I mean, forget consultants aside. I mean, actual hard construction costs. Doing, as we've discussed, your blower door testing, your quality control. You can have a third party doing it during your CA phase, but also you need to make sure that contracting team has their own internal QA/QC protocols in line to make sure, as you said, they're checking for that membrane, making sure that it's not being penetrated, and that they're implementing certain protocols to make sure before we wrap this floor and set the next units above, every check, every dot has been, T has been crossed and I has been dotted.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I mean, on the hard cost side, the biggest thing is the glazing, right? I mean, that's you're going in a lot of instances from double glazing to triple glazing. That's a significant increase in cost. Even in those rare instances where you're able to use double glazing, you're probably using a higher performing framing system than you would otherwise be doing. The introduction of UPVC windows and the kind of proliferation of those has brought that framing side down a bit, because those are of course more affordable than aluminum. There's there's a whole other conversation we could have about use of UPVC windows, but we won't get into that here. But so there's the glazing side of it, and then the other side of it is more on the mechanicals. You have energy recovery ventilation that is going to be required this is also where that premium is completely dependent on where you are, right? If you're in Boston, that premium is going to be like, maybe 1%, maybe less. If you're in New York, it's a little higher. If you're in Toronto, it's 2%, because there you may already be required to do mechanical ventilation in your building because of the code. That's happening all over the place. In New York, you're not currently required in a multifamily building, so you would be adding that whole system or potentially adding that whole system. And then there's additional costs in the commissioning. I think your point about the contractor is a good one, and one to there's kind of two sides. That there's the fear of the bid. I think we put it out as a passive house, you have all these kind of extra stipulations about air tightness. Do you get inflated numbers just to kind of make up for what's the unexpected there? So it's great to have people that have done this before, but to that end, there's a lot of subs and GCs out there that are seeing that this is happening and want to do this work. And we are finding on our projects, in my experience doing construction administration on Sendero Verde, talking to some of the subs on site, I mean, they're thrilled about what they're doing. They're fully engaged. They are excited to hear that we passed the blower door test. We've had masons, note to us on a site visit, hey, I saw an area where the AVB had some holes in it, and we patched it before you guys could inspect it. And so there's everyone's on board, and part of that is a business case for them, because they want to say, yeah, we were the mason on that 35-story passive house building. We can do this elsewhere.
Well, I think I heard you talk about that. I think it was on Passive House Accelerator, and it stuck with me. Instead of this, bury it, hide it before our architect or consultant comes on and finds it, it's more of a team effort, and call it out and sort of be proud or put forthright that, like, okay, we called this out. It's not to put you down. It's ultimately to achieve this underlying goal.
Right. And I think, and that's, all credit to, Steve Winter Associates and their great training kickoff there on, at least on Sendero. And then also to the GC team there at L&M Builders. They're doing a great job of getting everyone on the same page, getting everyone engaged. And they have a great staff that's kind of keeping track of everything on site. So, it's a very, on the verification and construction side of it, it's collaborative in the design and coordination side, of course, but it's also very collaborative on that kind of execution side, in a way that is really encouraging. It's great to see.
And
I think Ryan remembered what he wanted to say.
Yeah, I got it. Like it was as soon as you mentioned the CM, Lewis, like we've been blessed that on a lot of our projects, non-passive house projects, we like at Handel Architects, we like having a CM involved for pre-construction early on, bake in constructability, have them buy into whatever the vision of the project is, and so that then they can be effective communicators with their subs and helps the process along starting that early. It's even more vital on a passive house project, and it's interesting to see there's a pride, of craftsmanship, workmanship that is in the construction industry that we all are aware of, and when you see it, it's actually kind of cool, and you see it in passive house. Like so, we finished Monadnock construction, the Cornell Tech building. Like Lewis said, belts and suspenders. That was the first large scale passive house project in the United States, and so we had to pass our blower door test. We had to pass, right? So we had 3 AVBs. We had extra detailing in there to make sure that it passed, and so our air changes per hour, the target is 0.6. We ended up at 0.15. That's 4 times better than what we needed to do. So then when we went to Sendero Verde, affordable housing, where can we relax some of those criteria? But like the CMs though, and this is where the competitive juices get going. As soon as we started doing blower door testing on Sendero, I'm getting calls from the Monadnock construction guys going, hey, what's your number? What did you get? Did the BDARs, like that type of stuff. And so I kind of love that. It shows that people have bought into the process throughout. And let's just talk about QA/QC for a second here. When you have the blower door test, you're not just building the building and then testing the entire building when it's done. There's a guarded blower door test, and then there's an individual test beforehand where you're trying to identify potentially problematic areas so you can fix it before you replicate it thousands of times across the facade. So that's vital. Like you're not just going to, from an ownership's perspective, you're not just going to build a building and then test it at the end, pass, fail. If you fail, well, you're screwed.
I can't tell you
have
how
a
many
lot of
buildings I've
knowledge.
seen just a checkbox on the spec, 3 hose tests and 2 chamber tests, and wait till 80% of the facade is up. Then they throw up just to check that box, and then they discover a leak. And what are you going to do at that point?
Yeah, it's too late. And so, but with the passive house and the kind of the ongoing QA/QC and testing that's a part of it, about this way ahead of time, so that you're able to address it. So by the time you are doing your full building blower door test, there's no surprise there. You're going to pass it, or you have an idea exactly where you're going to be. Maybe someone left a big old door open somewhere that can cause something to go out of whack. But like you're going to pass because you've already done all the kind of intermediary QA/QC leading up to it.
Yeah, so one thing on a final note that I want kind of both of you to touch on are your thoughts on, I got to go to the glazing side for a second and talk about new glazing technologies, whether it's vacuum glazing, which you're seeing a lot of traction and interest and attention on now, things like dynamic glazing, dynamic glass, which you see implemented a lot now in New York and markets like Boston, and then maybe BIPV or building integrated photovoltaics, which haven't really gotten steam yet. But do you see a place for stuff like that in passive house applications, and sort of is that on the horizon for you in the future?
Yeah, I think we're in our broader target of building high performance buildings. All those things are kind of tools in the kit. And passive house is also like we love passive house, but we're not. Everything doesn't necessarily need to be a passive house. Maybe shouldn't be a passive house. Passive house is also a tool in the kit. It's a tool to manage your operational energy, as Ryan mentioned. It's great pairing that with other kind of goals. But I do think those specifically those technologies you've mentioned have a role in helping you achieve passive house certification. I mean, passive house does give you credit for renewable energy generated on site, so the BIPV could work well with that. The BIPV being kind of integrated largely into rain screens works well with a lot of a rain screen is a fantastic facade for a passive house building. on the glazing side, vacuum insulated glass. I think that when Ryan's saying that there's no limits aesthetically, well, yeah, that's true as long as you have no limits from a cost perspective. So maybe in the world where we want all glass passive house buildings, it's probably going to be a lot of vacuum insulated glass because I'm not sure how you achieve the R values that you need. But and that also, that vacuum insulated side is interesting in that there's I'm curious what the embodied carbon of all that compared to triple or quad pane IGUs is. Be interesting to kind of hear more about that. And then dynamic glazing is an interesting one because passive house relies, we're at least in the multifamily arena there, we are relying on a certain amount of solar heat gain to drive down heating loads. So there's this kind of push and pull between solar heat gain limitations and what you actually want to allow into your building. So we've run into now multiple times where the solar heat gain that our passive house consultant is telling us we should target is actually higher than what code prescriptively allows. And there's, so that's kind of an interesting negotiation that'll have to happen moving forward. But that brings up a challenge for dynamic glazing, where dynamic glazing, is largely driven by glare control and daylighting, which are obviously fantastic things to be paying attention to. But if you're, at the time, if you're in the middle of winter and you're focused on glare and you're darkening your glass a little bit, yeah, you're going to impact that heat gain that you're kind of relying on in your model. So the relationship of that, I think, is not to say that there's not a place for it, but it's one that I think is yet to be negotiated between all the kind of parties and performance interests.
So Ryan, out of those three, which one excites you the most?
I mean, we use photovoltaics everywhere. I mean, we're already doing that. I think the dynamic glazing is interesting. It's the type of thing where you want to reduce your solar heat gain in the summertime. So, but maybe you're not using it to its full effect in the wintertime. And this is an area that I've been, like Lewis just mentioned, where if there's an SHGC target that's exceeding the max allowed by code, I see that potentially becoming a tension in the future, that we have to do some sort of performance-based code analysis, or there needs to be an avenue to allow for us to use and allow more solar heat gain into our buildings if we need it, from an energy perspective. And so I worry sometimes about codes getting too prescriptive in that regard, and that's one case that I think is going to be very clear and that we should be on the lookout for and talk to our code officials about, so that they are aware of passive house building, that there may be one or two things here that in each jurisdiction, like in New York, we had to get CCD ones for some of our buildings. Those are like variances. And that once we got it, then everyone was able to use it in the New York area. And so if, I'm now in Denver, and so like if we're doing a project out here, I'm sure there's going to be things that we need to make sure get a variation as well. And that's one that I'm seeing. The SHGC minimum target is one that I'm definitely keyed into right now.
This was awesome. I appreciate you guys coming on. In terms of Handel and where you guys focus, I know you're here in the Northeast, Ryan's developing the Midwest, and you guys are on the West Coast. So what would be the best way to reach out to you guys? And I guess, how would you give the best synopsis of where you guys are focusing in terms of markets?
I mean, passive house is great in climate zones 4, 5, and 6. That's across the United States, right? And so we're focused in New York, San Francisco, East Coast, West Coast. I'm now in Denver, which is in the Mountain West, and so we're trying to increase our presence here. We have a good presence down in Atlanta and Texas as well, and so those are areas that we're focusing on, like mass timber and other types of initiatives where you could do a passive house, but maybe it's not the best strategy. And so I mean, we work across all different climate zones, building types, and everything. And I know that the passive house work is going to continue. I think it's most likely to continue in the Northeast because the regulatory framework there is such that it's not as big of a leap to go from what a code compliant building is to passive house. And we already know the benefits of the passive house buildings, and I think a lot of developers and clients are keyed into that. And so that's where we're getting, I think, the most traction at the moment. But I'm waiting for our first passive house in Chicago. It hasn't happened yet, but
well, I think Seattle could be a great market for you guys too.
Yeah, Seattle, a great market. Yeah.
All right, Ryan and Lewis, I appreciate you coming on. This was a lot of fun.
Great, thanks, Adrian.
All right, cheers, guys.